America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Alfredo Ortiz, CEO of Job Creators Network.
Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, I am so excited because we are joined by Lee Habeeb, the great Lee Habeeb. He is the founder and host of Our American Stories. He's also an advisory board member of JCN, which we will talk about because he was one of the brain trusts behind founding JCN. He's also has an incredible backstory. He helped launch the Laura Ingraham Show in 2001, helping to grow the fifth biggest nationally syndicated radio show in the country. He joined Salem Media Group as Vice President of Content, working with some of the biggest stars in the conservative spectrum, including Dennis Prager, Hugh Hewitt, Larry Elder, and Mike Gallagher. In 2021, his show, Our American Stories, was signed into a syndicated deal by Powerhouse iHeartMedia and is now one of the fastest growing nationally syndicated radio shows and podcasts in the nation, ranked number 11 by talkers.com and in 2023's Heavy 100. Lee, welcome to Main Street Matters.
Thanks for having me, Elaine and Alfredo. Appreciate it.
We were so excited to get you on. We were so excited to get you on. I think we could be on for 2 hours with you easily. So we'll have to condense a lot of questions to you in just a short podcast. But tell us about some of the exciting things that you've done that I talked about in your bio. I mean, you launched Laura Ingraham Show. You helped found Job Creators Network. I mean, tell us about the story of founding Laura's show. I mean, I've heard it before, but I think our listeners would love to hear it.
Well, you know, the radio business is a business, right? And at the time when we were listening to Rush, and that was the only place you could hear a conservative voice. You got to understand that. Rush was a cry in the wilderness to us conservatives. Back then, there was ABC, NBC, CBS. There was a little bit of cable TV. It was all liberal, and we knew it. And then you'd turn on the AM, and you'd hear this guy, Rush Limbaugh. That's what we wanted. We went to law school together at the University of Virginia, did some things, this or that, had a pretty good helper in William F. Buckley, who had sort of told us not to waste our lives being lawyers, and that this thing called radio could be remarkable, and that there'd never been a woman in the top 50 in talk radio. It was all men. And the business was really growing. Rush was the star, but in the same year we were nationally syndicated. Sean Hannity was syndicated, Mark Levin a year or two later, Beck a year or two later. So Rush had sort of created the demand. Now we needed more talent to fill the dials. I think there were only like 100 AM political talk stations in 1995. By the time we started, there were 1,000. So Rush created the industry, literally. And he saved the AM dial from oblivion. There was nothing happening on the AM dial. And so when Laura and I started, a funny story, you know, I would call up affiliates to try and get the show cleared. Part of what you do in syndication is you try and convince stations to take your show. If enough stations take it, you make money. If enough don't, you go to bankruptcy court. You're done. It's a business. So I'm Lebanese. We were born to do business. So I was on the air with her, but when the show was over, I started selling the show. And I would call up affiliates and say, "Hi, her name's Laura Ingraham. It's a talk radio show." And they'd go, "Oh, is it like Dr. Laura?" "No, it's not that kind of show, though that would be fun." "Wasn't that kind of show." "Well, is it like Delilah?" "No, it's not that kind of show." So they were reducing Laura to just love stuff or relational stuff. So we had to actually combat a lot of the sexism in the industry. I heard one particular gentleman, I won't name his name, very prominent in the business, who said no one wants to listen to a woman tell them about politics. Stick to cooking, stick to love. And, you know, Laura clerked for Clarence Thomas. I mean, she's not just another girl who fell off the turnip truck. And so we just stuck at it. And when Laura got the Marconi Award, which is the biggest award you can get for broadcasting, sort of its Oscar, I put my arm around that fella, who, by the way, called her one of the great broadcasting legends. And I said, nobody really wants to ever listen to a woman but to cook and he just laughed, right? Because sometimes what you have to do in a business is create a new business. And then from that, we put a lot of women on the air. We put on Ann Coulter before anybody else, Michelle Malkin. We championed great women voices. And we did this on purpose because prior to us, audience was about 75, 80% male. And we were always told, well, that we have a problem. Women don't listen. And we were like, well, maybe if women were the hosts, maybe more women would listen. Crazy idea. It worked. Laura's audience was almost 50-50. And then we sold a lot of stuff to those women because we let those stations know women make almost all the big purchasing decisions in a household. Men will buy some fishing tackle and bait. They'll buy some golf clubs. But the day-to-day stuff, the women buy it almost all. So we sort of helped. Laura forget her politics. Laura helped revolutionize talk radio for women.
Yeah, incredible story. Incredible story. You also had a vision for starting an organization that could not only educate the public, but amplify the small business voice. And that was Job Creators Network. Walk us through that story with Bernie Marcus and how you talked to him about it and sold it to him, frankly.
Sure. Well, it started with a problem. And most of the stuff I've ever done starts with a problem. And then I try and come in with a solution. And with Laura, there had never been a really smart, brilliant female host. Problem solution, right? So what happened is in 2008, 2009, when Obamacare was being sold, Fox Sunday News with Chris Wallace, at the time he was hosting Sunday News, had on a panel of guests. And it was the governors of Indiana and Michigan, Republican and Democrat. And they were sort of canceling each other out. The Republican hit the Republican line. The Democrat hit the Democrat line. And then there was the economist from Moody's, who was liberal. But there wasn't a conservative economist on the other side. There was a guy named Steve Wynn. And so when they went around the panel, there was the usual mumbo jumbo. When it got to Steve Wynn, Wynn was the last. And he was asked, are we in a recession? And is Obamacare going to be good for business owners? And all he said was, all due respect to the politicians and all due respect to the economists, I actually employ 3,000 people. I forget what he said, 3,000, 4,000 per hotel. And I know a lot about this. And Obamacare will hurt my business. And here's why. And we're on the edge of a recession. And just because you guys aren't calling it a recession, people aren't coming to my casinos and spending the money they used to spend. And I'm a harbinger of things to come because I'm a thing called discretionary income. And Americans are running out of it, which means soon they'll be running out of their regular income. So we put that up on Salem at the time. I gave that soundbite to the Salem host. I sent it to Laura, all my friends. And the next thing you know, it had like 50 million views. And so, of course, my hosts, Bill Bennett and Hugh Hewitt, were like, hey, get me CEOs. I want to hear from Steve Wynn. Well, our bookers would call all of these companies, and the company's HR department and the publicity department would never give us somebody to interview because they didn't want to take a stand. And so then it was like, well, let's get the small business guys to interview. And they were busy. So I went up to see Bernie Marcus. I said, Bernie, we got a problem. We need somebody to speak for business, like who actually employs people and who can hire and fire people and who feel the economy hit in ways that other people don't. Moreover, people really root for these family-owned businesses. Like a Steve Wynn is not AT&T. Steve built those hotels.
Right.
That was his and his wife's business. And so small, bigger, small, really big, small, this idea of these small businesses not being represented, Bernie formed Job Creators Network because he'd been thinking of very much the same thing and how employers could talk to employees about the impact of policies on their paychecks. Not how to vote, but just how to think about what happens if you raise taxes on a business. Well, the customer's going to have to pay. That's it. They're not going to eat the increase. And so how to get that into story form and out of the hands of PhDs and the like. And for my money, that's where we invested a lot of our capital, was in think tanks. And no disrespect to the best. And Steve Moore is one of the best. But there's still nothing like hearing from that small business person about the impact of tax cuts on them personally in their communities. That's how it started.
Great story. Alfredo?
Yeah, well, Lee, it's obviously then from there, I think it probably influenced your decision, because in 2021 to actually launch our American Stories, and it's been fascinating. I mean, I was actually fortunate to be one of your guests early on, but I've been following that. It's just amazing the trajectory that has taken. Can you kind of walk us through that, because you really kind of have been able to tie, I think, the learnings of Job Creators Network into our American Stories, and really that focus of the the real people and real lives. So can you walk us through and talk about that as well?
Sure. Somewhere in 2015, 2016, Bill Bennett's been a tremendous influence on my life. You're getting to know him now, but because he would always ask me hard questions. He'd ask you, how are we doing? But it wasn't how are we doing? It's like, what's really going on in our business, in my show, in your life? And, there was a show called This American Life that was on NPR, but had an incredibly extreme progressive bias. And Bill just said, what would that show sound like if the people interested were just interested in the subjects they did, rather than pick the subjects ahead of time to fit their narrative? And it really hit me. It struck me that what would a show sound like that just told classic American stories? No ideology. If we're going to tell the story of John F. Kennedy's wife, Jacqueline, and how she saved Grand Central, tell that story. So she's a Democrat. I don't care. Hey, the unions, we used to have 12-year-olds working in factories 6 days a week. Not good, right? So in other words, just tell history straight and tell stories of America straight. And that's how American Stories started. It started as a thought experiment. And moreover, would people be interested in stories about our founding, stories about Home Depot and how it started? Bernie's story is an unbelievable story of the underdog. George Washington's story is a story of the underdog. We Americans love underdog stories, and almost everybody who ever comes to this country, Alfredo, your mom, right? Your family, Elaine, somewhere in your roots, someone sailed the sea, right? And they sailed the sea, not because they were doing so well in the countries they were from. That's not who sailed here, right? For the most part, who sailed here were our tired and our huddled masses, who came here for work, came here to love this country and the freedoms our country afforded that others didn't. So I deeply believe that the way people learn is through stories. And we've been at this now for almost 8 years. And we're now on 1,419 stations and all over the country, big ones, small ones, big cities, little towns. And you would never know that we're, quote, Republicans or Democrats. We're just telling the story straight up about triumph, about failures and tragedies. Not every business succeeds. Lots fail. Many overcome their failures. But we tell them all, warts and all, tragedy and all. And I think that's been the reason the show is a success. We also get underneath where does money come from, right? I love going into schools and telling people just the story of Home Depot. Like the problem Home Depot solved, right? Because that's how Bernie Marcus acquired and got wealth. He didn't steal it from anybody. He didn't force it from anybody. No one's forced to go to a Home Depot and wander those aisles and get the stuff they're going to use to do a home improvement project at their house. And all those guys who show up at 6 a.m, if you ever go there at 6 a.m, all those small builders getting their wood and their drywall, Bernie was solving a problem for those guys. They wanted to be able to compete with the big home builders, and they were paying huge markups from small hardware stores. By the way, there are plenty of small hardware stores still in business. The idea that Bernie put them all out of business isn't true. But, there were certain things that and certain problems that small HVAC guy needed help with, or the drywall guy needed help with, or the carpenter needed help with. No. And Bernie was able to buy wood cheaper, pass along those savings so those guys could compete against the big guys. And then my mom built our basement out, and she couldn't afford a contractor. So she went to those Home Depot classes on Saturdays that Bernie offered for free. Yep. And my mom learned how to cut tile. Well, we all did. And how to cut brick and how to run a gas line. I mean, we ran a gas. We shouldn't have done that. Not good, right? But we ran a gas line for our little natural gas stove. And it took about 6 months, and we have a beautiful finished basement. And we thanked Home Depot for that. They trained us. They sold us the goods at affordable rates, and we couldn't afford the contractor. And so these are the things good businesses do. They solve problems. They take care of human needs. And there are real human beings running this. And there are some schmucky capitalists, right? And they give capitalism a bad name. But for every schmuck that steals, that's not a good business model, by the way. Making bad chicken for Chick-fil-A and not being good to the customers. You'll be at Chick-fil-A's doors will close in 6 months if they start to take advantage of their 40 or 50-year heritage of making great chicken at a great price with beautiful, wonderful service. And so those are the stories we like to tell people. It's hard to hate capitalism after you hear enough of these stories. It's hard to hate it. It doesn't mean capitalism's perfect, because it's not. It's not even close to perfect. But boy, is it. And when we tell the refugee stories of people who've escaped Vietnam and Cuba and more recently Venezuela, oh, be still my heart. You get to hear the socialism stories from those guys and the communism stories. And that's not us proselytizing. My favorite is Wat Wang's story, a Vietnamese refugee. And he set the record straight on the Vietnam War first. The Americans weren't there to take the jungle. There was no land to take. We were trying to protect the Vietnamese from the Viet Cong and from the communists. And when we left, Pol Pot made a mess of the place. And our soldiers took on thousands of Vietnamese refugees onto our ships. He was one of them. And Catholic Charities adopted him and his family. And he made his way to the Gulf Coast, where they started a family business that was the shrimping business. And they put him through medical school, and he's one of the top brain surgeons in the entire Southeast. And he says, thank you, America. Thank you. The Pol Pot would have killed me. I would have never been who I am. And so we love those refugee stories, because those are American dreamer stories too. You don't have to start a business to be an American dreamer. You can want to become a doctor or a nurse or a teacher. You can dream. And by the way, who pays the teacher's salaries are those capitalists. Those businesses pay the teacher's salaries. And we lay that stuff in. We let people know that if we're telling a teacher's story or the story of a song, we love telling stories of songs, because in the end, songs have value, intellectual property rights value. And if the songwriter weren't allowed to keep the value of his song, why would he write it? And how would he feel if somebody just decided, or she, because my favorite is Dolly Parton's I Will Always Love You. We told the story of that song and how Elvis tried to steal it from her, literally steal it from her. And she wouldn't have it. And ultimately she got it to Whitney Houston 20 years later and made tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars. And by the way, what a story about intellectual property. Little rural country girl and from the Smoky Mountains who's poor, lets Whitney Houston, who grew up upper middle class in Newark, the daughter of royalty in the music business, and black and white got together, North and South got together to make this incredible piece of music. The way Whitney sings it, if you don't hear God in that, you're deaf. And it made a fortune for everybody and made the world a better place. It's a story of capitalism, that song. And it wouldn't have been possible without intellectual property rights. And so, this has been, I think, the reason for the success of the show. There's nothing political about that. I don't care how Whitney Houston votes or Dolly Parton. It's of no matter. I don't care who they sleep with. I don't care how and to whom they pray. It's just a beautiful story. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, your stories are incredible on there, and it's amazing some of the guests you've had on there. Talking about storytelling, just staying on that topic a little bit. I mean, thinking about what is the most read storytelling book in history?
Yep.
The Bible, right?
Hands down.
We have literally, this is how we've lived from probably the beginning of man all the way through, right? Storytelling has been such an important part of how we learn from our history. And, you and I have been working on a project recently, and if you're comfortable enough to talk about it, something that I've kindly called the Book of Lee, the missing Bible book. But one of the things that we talk about is really wealth, right? Because it looks like the left has actually co-opted the idea of what was taught in the Bible about wealth, and basically saying that wealth is bad. You've had an incredible kind of focus and point of view on that. And I'd love to talk to people about that right now, if you wouldn't mind.
No, I'd love to. I mean, and this particularly goes out to Christians because there are parables in the Bible. Jesus teaches through story, and there are a bunch of different parables that we know, that we think we know at least. And what I wrote about were several of them. The first is the parable of the talents. And I don't know if you remember it, but I can recount and tell you quickly that, the master gave one servant 5 talents. That's gold or some kind of measure of currency at the time. But by the way, we could use that as talent itself, right? Because God gives us all different and varying talents. He doesn't give us equal talents. This is crazy. Look, I'm 5'10" and bald. I was a great basketball player until I was 17, but I stopped growing. That was it for me. I did not get distributed equally NBA basketball talent, right? And it wasn't fair, but that's life, right? But I was given other God-given talents, and my job was to find them. So one got 5, one got 3, one got 2, and one got 1. And so the one that got 5 could have sat around and said, oh, yay, I'm special. I got 5. I'm going to just spend it. No, the 5 invested the 5, got 5 back, showed it to his master, and the master was pleased. He didn't rebuke him. He was pleased. Job well done, good and faithful servant. 2, the person with 2 doesn't sit there and go, oh, he got 5, I only got 2. Not fair. Oh, and I got 1 more than you, you dummy, you got 1. Nah. No, none of that. He took the 2, he put it to work, he got 2 more. The same master was equally pleased with that person. But the guy who got 1 was jealous. He was mad. He was angry. Well, why did he get 2? Why did he get 5? So when the master said, well, tell me what you've done with your money, he said, I put it in the ground, oh hard master. And the master sent him off, gnashing of teeth. And this is Jesus telling that story. So he wants us to be good stewards. This is really important to him. Then there's the parable of the prodigal son, right? One son goes away, blows dad's money. The other son stays home. He's an earnest good son. Well, like any good father, as the son comes back who blew the money, repentant and wanting to join the family, the dad runs toward him and then throws a party. Well, the so-called good brother who stayed behind got really mad at the father. And the rebuke was the same. That's not fair. Well, the master and Jesus was telling that story because the bad son now was the son who stayed at home. He couldn't experience the joy of his brother's repentance. He couldn't experience the joy of his father running to his lost son because he wasn't lost anymore. He was a selfish little jerk, the brother who stayed home. And so here's Jesus making us think again, which person do we want? If we're a father, do we want to be the man running towards the kid who had messed up, or wait at home and when the kid comes back, give him a lecture about how I told you so and not let him back at home? So these are really great stories. And then one of the other ones we tell, and we focus on 7 big stories, 6 parables of Jesus, but then Cain and Abel, because envy and coveting is a big part of this book. And Winston Churchill said of socialism that socialism is the gospel of greed and the gospel of envy. And envy is a corrupting influence. It's the 10th commandment. And I think it's the 10th commandment because it's the worst. It eats up people. And the envious and the covetous get stuff because they steal it or they appropriate it, and it's never enough. And the first story of coveting, of course, is Cain and Abel, right? Cain gives an offering and Abel gives an offering. And the father favors Abel's offering. We don't know why, but we know Cain's response. And Cain's response wasn't anger at his brother. Cain's response was anger at God, right? Am I my brother's keeper? That's what he says when God asks him what he's done. And by the way, God already knew what he had done. He was mad at God, and he was actually mocking God. Am I my brother's keeper? And of course, he slew his brother, but what he was really mad at was his father. The object of his anger was God. The victim was his brother. And so we tell these stories about abundance too. Job is a story about losing everything, but being faithful and getting it back. And that Abraham he did okay. And Solomon, why did Solomon and David lose things? Because they weren't obedient to God. And then the last story, that the young man who goes to God, the rich young man, the parable of the rich young man. If you remember, he goes to the Lord and he says, Lord, how do I get to heaven? How do I get to eternity? And the Lord gives him a bunch of commandments. Thou shalt not. Did you steal? Did you cheat? Did you lie? And he says, no, I have not broken any of those commandments. Now, the Lord knew this, but then he said to the rich young man, well, I ask you then to surrender everything and follow me. Well, if you remember the next line, the young man, it says the young man had a sad face and he left. He couldn't give the money away and he couldn't be obedient to his Lord. It wasn't that he was the problem wasn't that he was wealthy. The problem was that he put his wealth over God. He worshiped his wealth. God was testing him and he couldn't do it. And it saddened him because he knew it. He knew he loved his money more than God. And that's why God punished him. He didn't punish him because he was rich. Punished him because his wealth had become idolatry. And that's the key. Socialists will say rich man can never get to heaven. But my goodness, the Bible is replete with abundance for people who obey the Lord. It's not prosperity gospel, by the way. It doesn't mean you're going to be a millionaire, but the abundance of life. And by the way, what does that mean? The abundance of family, right? The abundance of love. The rich guy who has no love is not rich. It's dumb. He's a loser. And the middle class guy who's got family and love all around his life is rich. This is the story of Jesus. It's love. It's loving one another, serving one another. That's a rich and wealthy life, and he's pleased. Jesus was not a capitalist, by the way, but he was most definitely not a socialist. This is nonsense. So I spent, and thanks to you all for letting me dig into that and get past this idea that you could put Jesus or God in a box. Jesus isn't a Republican or a Democrat. He's not a Norwegian or an American. It's, my mind is not like yours. Remember the great line from the Bible? My mind is not like yours. Well, duh. Nothing close. But this idea of serving him in obedience and then serving others. Look, if free markets are about anything else, it's the guys who serve others that do the best. There aren't thieves in capitalism. There are bad people in capitalism. But good luck running a prosperous business over a long time with the fundamental basis being lying, cheating, and prevaricating. It just doesn't happen.
Well, I always love highlighting the story of Chick-fil-A and the Cathys because, boy, is that an example of capitalism and entrepreneurship done right. But it's an amazing story of almost servant leadership, and that could be another whole different segment on the Cathys, and maybe we should do that as well at some point, Lee. But
indeed, it's a hell of a story. It's an amazing story.
Yeah, no, it really is. And, I'm excited. Thank you for going into that little piece there, because I wanted to give our listeners a little preview of a book that we're going to be publishing soon, written by you and others. And I tell you, the read is great. It really has an interesting perspective that I don't think has been told, and has to be, because unfortunately, the socialists that are in our country have basically made the idea that wealth is bad. Yes. It's the love of wealth that's bad. And, to be clear, and you've done a great job of laying that out. And within the next few weeks, we'll be pushing that out, and our listeners will be able to get a copy for themselves. And I can't wait to get that out.
Well, I'm looking forward to it myself.
Lee, what I love about our American stories and your whole approach is it's not political. It's really about going back to what makes America such an incredible place. It is, we're entitled to equal opportunity, but not equal results. And I think the left has done such a great job at dividing us on so many lines: rich versus poor, Black versus white, religious versus non-religious, gay versus straight. I mean, I could go on and on about their power is derived from the negativity of division. And if we could get back to and get others doing the same thing that you're doing, the same thing that Job Creators Network does when we elevate small business owners' voices and get them talking in the media and testifying, they're not political. What they care about is policy, not politics. And they want policies that help them help their businesses. But how can we send you to Washington so that you can help politicians understand that attacking the other side is not going to get us ahead, is not going to bring back the conservative values that made this country what it is?
Well, look, I've always thought that each side has contributed at different times to this great country. I've seen great Democrat administrations, great Republican administrations, but the essential nature that this is a nation of limited government, right? And that word limited is really important, that we, the people, should retain as much power as possible, and that free markets solve lots of problems, and that the more regulations you put on businesses, the more it hurts the small guy and not the big guy. The big guy can absorb the complexity of a regulatory state. Justice Gorsuch has just come out with a fascinating book, and you would think it would be a book about jurisprudence or the Supreme Court, but it wasn't. It was about a bunch of stories that he saw in his courtroom or heard about in other courts, small business owners mostly, who had either violated laws they didn't know they violated and found themselves in administrative courts that they could not afford to defend themselves in, and or had committed crimes they didn't even know they'd committed because the code was so complex. And he hearkened back to James Madison, who said, look, rule of law matters, but what if we get ruled by law, right? And what if bureaucrats and interpreters of those laws run our country? And what if you're involved in the administrative state under their jurisprudential regime? By the way, anybody who's ever been messed up or crosshairs with the IRS knows the administrative law is different. Here's how administrative law works. The administrative body claims you're guilty. So the IRS will issue a levy. And you're sitting there with your accountant, and your accountant's going, they're wrong. And you're going, well, I want to fight it. And the accountant says, you're going to lose. And if you lose, it's going to cost you a lot. But if we settle, we're fine. But I don't want to settle. No, you need to settle, right? And that's because they have your money. They have the clock ticking on the interest payments, and they have the law. And they're judge, jury, and prosecutor. And so you pay. And then you hate them for it, right? So can you imagine being caught up, small bank, in the SEC, right? A car company caught inside the EPA, or a small farmer inside the EPA, and these huge administrative bodies who don't care about you. And the big guys can defend themselves because they have the money and the wherewithal to do it. The little guy can't. And then he gets absorbed by the big guy, and at less value than he was when he was a little guy. And by the way, what really happened, a classic story we told, was of a small banker who got caught in the crosshairs of Dodd-Frank. This is a major piece of legislation that got passed in 2009. He actually took Dodd-Frank, made copies of it, and put it in the front of his building under a display to show people why his bank was closing, or it would. And then he showed the old code before Dodd-Frank, and then the older code when he started. And one was just a few pages, one was a lot of pages, and the next one was like stacks and stacks and stacks of pages. And of course, he had to sell his bank to a bigger bank. And it was the bigger banks, remember, that got us in trouble in the first place. And of course, who loses when small and regional banks close? Small business in that area that needs lines of credit from those small guys. So when I went to Bernie all those years ago, it was how do we help the little guy? And by the way, Americans on the left and right have a big heart for the local mom and pop store, right? Because they know they're not political. They also know they give to if they succeed, those small businesses in a little town, then they've got a school system that's functional. They have a little league. And by the way, when you go to the little league, there are all those signs around the outfield. Who are those signs? Those signs are the local businesses supporting the little league. So people don't look at their local business and go, oh, that evil dry cleaner. Oh, he's a capitalist. That pizzeria, that owner, oh, he's bad. No, once you become a multi-billion-dollar company, then suddenly you're evil, right? But so that's what that's what I love about the work the Job Creators Network does, is you use the voices of these folks and you don't ask them, how do you vote, right? You don't ask them, but sometimes they'll say, thank you so-and-so for this tax cut. I was able to hire more people. I was able to build the wing of my restaurant out. Be still my heart. Even people who don't like tax cuts for businesses might go, never thought of it that way. I like her. I like her restaurant. Oh, I'm glad it has more space. Didn't know that a tax cut might create more revenue in my local town. It's complicated. But boy, when you tell a story, he says right back to Jesus, you tell the story, you disarm people with a story. People aren't ready to argue with you and, tell me your story. They're not going to argue, but tell me your opinion. Oh my goodness. You're never going to change someone's mind, first of all. But second of all, who cares? There are so many opinions now. The world is awash of so many opinions that anybody who can tell a story and by the virtue of that story, get people to think about something a little differently because they felt differently about something first. And I think that's the real power of stories is they hit your heart and then process to your head. And I think the human being has been hardwired for story from the beginning of time, but not for charts and graphs. And regrettably, a lot of the free enterprise and free market people have been chart and graph people. And they're the wrong people to tell the story of free enterprise in this country. Totally wrong. And we have favorites, and our audience has favorites of free enterprise stories. The first female millionaire in America is a perennial favorite. We play it twice a year. And she was also just happened to be African American. And that was Madam C.J. Walker. And she grew up in a very plantation that her parents were slaves in Louisiana. She was a sharecropper there. Because slavery ended didn't mean it was all kumbaya. Now blacks were living like poor whites. They were working the land, and by the end of the year, they had nothing. Nothing. And they were buying from the local company's store. Welcome to the reality of living in the 18th and 19th centuries. Not the best time to be alive if you want to maybe have a 401k and maybe go on a little 2-week vacation, right? This wasn't life then. And so Madam C.J. Walker gets married young, gets away from terrible, abusive husbands, and ultimately tragedy after tragedy. But through all that tragedy, trying to raise a child by herself, she's starting to lose her hair because there was no running water at the time. There were a lot of scalp infections for many women. So she wanted to come up with something that would solve the scalp infection problem. She did, but then she had to come up with a way to sell it. And she was in a church choir. So when she would visit other choirs, she would find a woman, do an experiment on her head, show everybody how the product worked. And then that woman would buy product from her and sell the product locally. And then she'd go to the next church to church to church across the country. And long before there was Mary Kay, there was Madam CJ. She created a sales force from all those women whose scalps they'd cured and all those women who were in the traveling choruses and were trusted and were good. And Madam C.J. Walker, when she died, before she died, she was trying to get into the big Booker T. Washington mail. It was for business owners, and it was in D.C., a big convention. And she tried to crash it. But Booker T. and the team said, I'm sorry, no women allowed. Well, proving that sexism cuts across all racial categories at the time. Well, Madam CJ would have nothing of it. When there was an open comment period, she went to the microphone and gave a speech that her great-great-great-granddaughter told on our show. She read it word for word. And it was, I started as a washerwoman. And she talked about every horrible job she had, about how her parents were slaves. And she goes, and I've built factories across this great country, and I've employed thousands, and I've made many women rich. And we women deserve a seat at this table, at this chamber. And the place just was startled. The next year, she became the first female member of Booker T. Washington's Negro Businessman League. And so these are beautiful stories of triumph over tragedy. You can't walk away from the Madam C.J. Walker story. She died living not just blocks away from Rockefeller. She owned these beautiful open carriages, and woman after woman thanked her, black woman. I made more money is one ad. One ad was a young African-American woman saying, I make more money taking care of my friends' scalps than I do washing floors for a month. I make more money in a day. So this idea of empowerment, of economic empowerment, is a remarkable thing, and it's uplifting, and it's beautiful. And so the Madam C.J. Walker story is a perennial favorite not because she got rich, but how she got rich and who she was. And it wasn't just a story about money. It was a story about all the people she enriched along the way and empowered along the way, because that's the only way you're going to accrue wealth, is to create lots of wealth for other people and make the world a better place. And that's what capitalism does, and it's irrefutable. It's irrefutable that the world's a better place because of it. And yet we have problems with capitalism that the markets don't solve every problem. And that's why we have philanthropies. That's why we have churches. That's why we have free schools. And so, the show is not a show that simply celebrates capitalism. It's a show that celebrates individuals and their enterprises. And almost every enterprise that we all know started with some fascinating character, from Steinway and Sons to Jelly Belly, you name it. Piggly Wiggly is an amazing story. Colonel Sanders, you name it. And adversity's right at the top of that list. Lots of it. And risking a lot to get there. I mean, the idea that these guys just steal and take, as opposed to, well, actually, many of them come across just a little bit crazy because of what they risk and how much they risk in order to get done what they do. So, that's been the joy of the show, is how much I've learned from these historians and sports historians too, because our sports are business. Our music business is a business. And we've exported all these things to the world. The world watches our basketball. The world watches our football. We watch the world's football, but they watch ours. Our jazz, our country music, our blues music, our rock and roll, that's ours. We're exporting to the world. It's unique. It's beautiful. It's us. It's all of us, all of the different ethnicities smashed together to create this beautiful intellectual property and product that's changed the world forever. And again, it's all nothing without free markets, without intellectual property rights and property rights as being almost a divine inspiration. By the way, remember, thou shalt not steal, the sixth commandment, imputes that God wants us to own property. And then the parable of the tenants is the best story that Jesus tells about the property owner. Because if you remember, the tenants got together and robbed from the landlord, and then they killed the landlord's son, right? And Jesus didn't rebuke the landlord. He rebuked the servants who should have just done their work, returned the much of the profit to the owner, and some of the profit for themselves. Now, Jesus wouldn't have liked the landlord who stole from the tenants either, but that wasn't the parable. The parable was about the tenants stealing from the landlord, and that's socialism. It's the leaders stealing from the citizens. And that's what happens with pure socialism in every place it's been tried. America has some socialism, though. I mean, Social Security is a form of socialism. We're not a purely capitalistic society, and praise God we're not, because it wouldn't be a livable country. We want a safety net for our old and our sick. No one's arguing. We're not relitigating whether there should be Medicare anymore. The question is just how old and how much. But we don't want to leave old people starving and dying. And so, we capitalists have to be realistic when we talk about government too. And that is, what is Caesar's and what is ours? And it's been a conversation we've been having as the American people, and a debate we've been having from our founding. And it's a great debate, right? Because conservatives aren't always right. And liberals aren't always right. And sometimes one's more right for its time, and then one's terribly wrong for its time. But what Job Creators Network is doing in terms of putting the small business owner first is epic. It's important. Fighting for the fundamental fairness and decency and treatment by the United States tax code of small business owners who are harmed by the big multinational companies who could care less if the little guy succeeds or not. They say they care, but they don't, but in the end, they're not fighting for a smaller regulatory code on their behalf because it benefits them in the end. It thwarts their competitors. And when they go to buy their smaller competitors, they buy them more cheaply.
Absolutely. Lee, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your vision behind this. I think that this is the way to win Americans back to loving this country and understanding where we have come from. And we've come far, and we have farther to go and more to learn about each other and to be more accepting and forgiving. But without the storytelling, I don't think it's going to happen. So I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing. Tell our audience where they can go to find out more about Our American Stories and listen to it.
If you're iHeartMedia iHeart has a podcast and an app. Apple, wherever you get them, just type in Our American Stories, and we've got, I think, almost 1,100 stories now on everything. You name it, we've covered it.
That is fantastic. Fantastic. Well, again, thanks for joining us. And thank you to our audience for tuning in to listen. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. We'll be back real soon with a new episode. Thanks so much.